It's the end of the world. Just kidding.
I mean, it certainly feels like it sometimes.
Right. But seriously, if you grew up in certain religious traditions, you have probably heard that the Book of Revelation is this detailed, terrifying prediction of the actual end of the world.
And your mind probably goes straight to pop culture, right?
Oh, inevitably. I mean, we've all seen the movies.
We immediately think of the Antichrist, the mark of the beast.
Modern barcodes on people's foreheads?
Essentially, we picture the literal fiery end of planet Earth.
That is the dominant cultural framework, yes.
What if this book wasn't predicting modern technology or, global dictators thousands of years in the future?
Right.
What if instead it was a coded historical resistance document written for real people surviving an ancient, unimaginable trauma?
I know biblical scholars use something called academic hermeneutics to decipher this. Can you break down what that approach actually looks like when we apply it to these terrifying images?
Of course. Academic hermeneutics is essentially a scholarly framework for interpretation. It means we are looking deeply at the historical context, the specific literary genre, and, most importantly, how the original first-century audience would have understood the text.
If we want to know what it means, we really have to transport ourselves back to the Roman-Jewish War.
We have to understand the reign of the Caesars.
We have to feel the intense social and economic pressure of living as a marginalized minority in the first-century Roman province of Asia Minor.
So we basically have to read it through their eyes, not ours. Because to read this book the way a first-century person would have read it, we have to learn their language. And I don't just mean translating ancient Greek into English. I mean, we have to understand the language of the apocalyptic genre itself.
Yes.
Because the way they use that word is totally different from how we use it today.
When we hear the word apocalyptic today, mostly thanks to Hollywood and sci-fi literature, we immediately picture global destruction.
Zombies, post-apocalyptic wastelands, nuclear fallout.
The physical end of the globe. But I'm guessing that is not what the word meant to an ancient Greek speaker.
Not at all. If you said apocalypse to someone in the ancient Mediterranean, they wouldn't look up at the sky waiting for fire. The word comes from the ancient Greek word apocalypsis, and it literally translates to unveiling or disclosure or revelation. It's the act of pulling back a curtain to show you a hidden reality that is already there. It's not necessarily a timeline of the distant future.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense given the title, The Book of Revelation. But this isn't just about one book, right? Like, this is an entire literary genre. So how do historians actually define what makes something an apocalypse?
Well, it's a very specific, highly structured form of ancient literature. They define it as a type of writing where a heavenly messenger, usually an angel, reveals hidden realities to a human recipient.
Okay.
And those hidden realities are usually about the supernatural world above, or the true nature of the historical events happening on the ground below.
And to communicate those hidden realities, these writers used a vocabulary that feels, let's be honest, like a fever dream to a modern reader. I mean, you open these texts and you are instantly hit with multi-headed beasts rising from the ocean, stars falling from the sky, the sun turning black, and these highly specific symbolic numbers.
Yes, the numbers are key.
You see the number 7 used constantly for divine completeness, or massive figures like 144,000. So what is the actual function of all this wild imagery?
To the original audience, this wasn't random hallucination or fantasy. It was a well-understood symbolic code. And to understand why they used this code, you have to understand the genre's primary function. It was crisis literature.
Crisis literature. Let's pause on that because that completely flips the script. Instead of predicting the future, it's about surviving the present.
These texts emerged during times of intense, unimaginable trauma, oppression, and war. They were written by and for marginalized people to give them a sense of moral clarity when their world was literally falling apart.
Wow.
When an oppressive empire is crushing your people, apocalyptic literature offers the ultimate hope that divine justice sees what is happening and will ultimately overthrow those corrupt, violent empires.
I want to trace how this genre actually evolved, because it didn't just pop out of nowhere in the first century. Where does this cosmic, world-ending language actually start?
We have to go back to ancient Judaism, specifically the era of the First Temple. Even back then, prophetic traditions, if you look at the writings of Isaiah or Jeremiah, were using this massive cosmic imagery.
Like the heavens shaking or the sun going dark.
But they weren't describing the end of the physical universe. They were using cosmic language to describe the very real, earthly collapse of political kingdoms.
And that earthly collapse became devastatingly real in 586 BCE. This is a date that historians point to as a massive rupture. The Babylonian Empire conquered Jerusalem and completely destroyed the First Temple. And I want to make sure we really grasp the scale of this for you listening. For the ancient Israelites, the temple wasn't just a big church. It was believed to be the literal physical intersection of heaven and earth. So if someone destroys it,
your entire universe collapses. The psychological impact of the Babylonian exile was a world-ending trauma.
and because of that trauma, Babylon gets burned into the collective memory of the Jewish people. It becomes the ultimate coded symbol. Long after the actual historical Babylonian Empire fell to dust, writers would use the name Babylon as a shorthand code for any arrogant, oppressive superpower that stood against divine justice.
That's a great way to put it. Now, if we follow the historical timeline, the Jewish people eventually return and rebuild the Second Temple around 516 BCE. But they don't regain their true independence. They are passed around, living under successive foreign empires. First the Persians, and then the Greeks, which brings us to a major flashpoint in the 2nd century BCE.
Right, the Greek Seleucid Empire, specifically a king named Antiochus IV Epiphanes.
Antiochus instituted a campaign of horrific, systematic persecution against the Jewish people. He outlawed their religious practices and desecrated the Second Temple. And it is this specific unbearable crisis that gives birth to the book of Daniel.
And Daniel is a huge blueprint for our deep dive today, isn't it? Because this is where the imagery of the beasts really takes center stage. Daniel has these visions of monstrous, terrifying beasts rising up out of the sea.
And the text of Daniel explicitly tells us what those beasts are. They represent violent, successive political empires. Think about the brilliance of this. When an ancient writer wanted to critique a violent dictator without getting executed for treason, they didn't write a direct political pamphlet naming the king. They wrote an apocalypse about a multi-headed beast.
It's basically an ancient political cartoon. It's highly symbolic. Anyone on the inside knows exactly who the artist is making fun of. But if the secret police find it, you just say, hey, it's just a crazy dream about an animal.
Daniel establishes this visual vocabulary of resistance.
But most importantly, the defining feature of the apocalyptic genre is the promise of imminent divine justice.
Because these texts were written for oppressed people.
Exactly. People who desperately needed to know that the empires currently crushing them were temporary, and that God was ultimately going to balance the scales.
Okay, so we are dealing with a deeply symbolic, poetic genre, but there is also a huge linguistic nuance here. Because when we read English translations of certain apocalyptic texts, especially in the Gospels like Matthew chapter 24, we constantly see the phrase, the end of the world.
Yes. That specific translation choice has arguably fueled more modern anxiety than almost any other phrase in the Bible.
Right.
But if you look at the original Greek manuscripts, the phrase used there is syntelia tuainos. The key word there is aion. It does not mean the physical planet Earth. It refers to an era, an epoch, or an age.
An age.
The phrase is much more accurately translated as the end of the age.
Wow.
For a first-century Jewish audience, hearing about the end of the age was not about the literal destruction of the terrestrial globe.
They weren't imagining the planet exploding or burning up.
No, they were talking about the end of a specific historical and religious order.
And in their specific context, the order they were talking about was the temple-centered religious system.
The temple wasn't just a church to them. It was the political, economic, and theological center of the universe. So the end of the age meant a catastrophic shift in how the world operated, specifically regarding their covenant with God and the existence of the temple.
Which brings us directly to the historical climax of the 1st century. Because if we really want to understand why someone would write a dense, heavily coded book about the end of the age, we have to look at how their age actually ended in real life, under Roman rule. Because this tension didn't just appear out of nowhere.
No, it built up over a long time.
Roman involvement in Judea goes all the way back to the Roman general Pompey in 63 BCE.
Pompey intervened in a civil war in Judea and ended up capturing Jerusalem. From that moment on, the region was officially folded into the massive sphere of Roman influence. And over the next century, friction didn't just exist. It steadily grew to a boiling point.
The Jewish population was subjected to incredibly heavy Roman taxation.
It was economically suffocating. The Romans used a system of publicans, or tax collectors, who were notorious for extorting the local populace.
Basically state-sanctioned mobsters.
Essentially, yes. You had corrupt Roman governors, deep religious tensions, because the Romans were actively bringing pagan iconography into the Holy Land.
Which was a massive violation for them.
Huge! And you had a rapidly widening divide between a small group of wealthy aristocratic elites who collaborated with Rome and the desperate, overtaxed poor.
And out of this widespread desperation, these radical revolutionary factions started to form. The sources mentioned the Zealots, who basically believed that taking up arms and fighting a holy war against Rome was a religious duty. But then there's another group mentioned in our notes that sounds absolutely terrifying, the Sicarii.
The Sicarii were essentially an extreme militant splinter faction of the Zealot movement. The name literally translates from Latin as daggermen. They were an urban insurgency group. Their primary tactic was carrying small, easily concealed daggers called sekai hidden under their cloaks.
Okay.
They would wait for massive crowds, often during religious festivals in Jerusalem, and they would quietly assassinate Roman officials.
Wow.
Or even high-ranking Jewish leaders they suspected of collaborating with the Roman government.
So they would just stab someone in a packed crowd and disappear.
Yes. They would stab their target and then immediately blend right back into the screaming crowd, sometimes even pretending to be shocked and outraged by the murder themselves to avoid detection.
So you have this environment of absolute terror, crushing poverty, and urban insurgency. The tension is unbearable.
It's at a breaking point.
And the spark that finally ignites the full-scale Roman-Jewish war happens in 66 CE. What was the catalyst?
The catalyst involved the Roman governor of Judea at the time, a man named Gessius Florus. Florus was notoriously corrupt and cruel. In 66 CE, he demanded a massive amount of silver 17 talents to be taken directly from the temple treasury in Jerusalem.
You do not steal from the temple. I mean, even if you aren't religious, stealing the central bank's gold reserves is going to cause a massive riot.
It was the ultimate desecration. It was both a religious blasphemy and an economic assault. Massive riots erupted in the streets of Jerusalem.
Understandably.
The local population actually mocked Florus by passing around a basket, pretending to collect copper coins for him as if he were a beggar.
Oh, wow. They really went after his pride.
They did, and Florus responded to the mockery with horrific violence. He sent his soldiers into the upper market to slaughter the citizens and plunder the city.
Just a bloodbath.
He even had some of the Jewish nobility whipped and crucified, but his brutal response completely backfired.
It didn't stop the riots.
No, instead of suppressing the protests, the unrest spiraled completely out of his control. It escalated into an open, region-wide armed rebellion. The Roman-Jewish War had begun.
And we have to be clear, this was not a minor localized skirmish. This was an all-out, desperate war of independence against the greatest military superpower on the face of the earth. Rome's response was swift and overwhelming. They sent massive, highly trained legions to utterly crush the rebellion. Over the next few years, the Roman army systematically destroyed towns across Galilee and Judea, eventually pushing the surviving resistance fighters and refugees back into the fortified city of Jerusalem, completely surrounding it and laying siege to it.
The Siege of Jerusalem is documented as one of the most horrific, nightmarish events in ancient military history. What made it especially catastrophic was the internal factional chaos. The ancient historian Josephus provides a harrowing account. He tells us that while the formidable Roman legions were surrounding the outside of the city walls, rival Jewish factions were literally fighting a bloody civil war on the inside of the city.
They were so fiercely divided that rival militant groups actually set fire to their own city's grain and food supplies just to spite and weaken each other. Because of that unimaginable self-sabotage, a severe, agonizing starvation set in long before the Roman armies ever breached the walls.
The starvation became so extreme that desperate people began trying to sneak out of the city at night, risking everything just to forage for wild plants or roots in the surrounding valleys. The Roman soldiers would catch them. In a calculated effort to terrorize the city into surrendering, the Roman commanders ordered these refugees to be crucified outside the walls in plain sight.
It is hard to even picture that level of cruelty.
Josephus reports that they were crucifying up to 500 people a day. It reached a point of such grotesque industrial slaughter that the Romans literally ran out of wood and space for the crosses.
Imagine standing on the walls of your beloved city, looking out and seeing a forest of crosses surrounding you. And the climax of all this unimaginable horror comes in the year 70 CE. The Roman forces, led by the general Titus, finally breached the massive stone walls. They swarm the city, slaughtering thousands, and they completely destroy the Second Temple. They burn it to the ground. Just as Jesus had warned decades earlier, the destruction was so absolute that not one stone was left upon another.
It is impossible to overstate the psychological, cultural, and theological devastation of this single event.
Yeah.
We have to remember that for centuries, the temple was the absolute, undisputed center of the Jewish universe. It was the literal dwelling place of the divine on earth. It was the place where heaven and earth met. When the Roman legions set fire to the temple, it didn't just destroy a beautiful, monumental building. For the people watching it burn and for the diaspora Jews hearing the news weeks later, it literally felt like the end of the world.
The end of the age.
The end of the age. Their entire theological framework for how God interacted with humanity was suddenly a smoking, blood-soaked ruin. And Rome did not just destroy it. They weaponized their victory into a massive, empire-wide propaganda campaign to humiliate the survivors.
Rome made sure nobody in the empire would ever forget what happens when you rebel. If you visit Rome today, you can still stand in front of the Arch of Titus. It is a massive stone triumphal arch, and carved right into the side of it is a relief sculpture showing victorious Roman soldiers carrying the looted sacred treasures from the Jerusalem temple, including the giant golden menorah, and parading them through the streets of Rome as trophies. Furthermore, they imposed a punitive, deeply insulting tax on all Jews across the entire empire. It was called the Fiscus Judaicus.
Yes, the Fiscus Judaicus was a brilliantly cruel administrative move. Prior to the war, adult Jewish men voluntarily paid a half-shekel tax to maintain the temple in Jerusalem.
Okay.
After 70 CE, the Romans mandated that this exact tax still had to be paid. But now it was forcibly collected and sent to Rome to maintain the pagan temple of Jupiter Capitolinus.
You have got to be kidding me.
They were forcing a monotheistic people to fund the worship of the chief Roman god simply as a punishment for being Jewish.
And perhaps the ultimate lingering insult of this whole war. Historians point to evidence that the massive influx of wealth looted from Judea, the gold stripped from the temple, along with the slave labor of the captives, was actually used to fund the construction of Rome's most famous landmark.
The Roman Colosseum?
The Colosseum. The very symbol of Roman entertainment and power was built on the ashes of Jerusalem.
You can start to see how this profound historical trauma triggered a massive crisis of meaning.
A theological crisis.
The theological questions were agonizing. How could the one true God allow a pagan, idolatrous empire to absolutely destroy his holy dwelling place?
Was Rome's God stronger? Had God abandoned his people?
Precisely. To process this staggering cosmic injustice, there was a huge surge in apocalyptic writings. Texts like 4th Ezra, 2nd Baruch, and, as many critical scholars argue, the Book of Revelation emerged directly out of this milieu.
They were trying to make sense of the horror.
They were written to help marginalized, traumatized communities make sense of the horror, to reaffirm that God was still sovereign, and to maintain hope that divine justice would eventually prevail against the Roman machine.
Okay, so that perfectly sets up the environment. But to understand how early Christians specifically viewed this crisis, we have to look at their own internal sources. We have to look at what Jesus himself said about the temple, decades before it fell.
Right.
In the Gospels, specifically Matthew chapter 24, Mark chapter 13, and Luke chapter 21, we find this massive block of teaching known as the Olivet Discourse.
A very famous passage.
Jesus is sitting with his disciples on the Mount of Olives. They are looking across the Kidron Valley at this magnificent, shining, massive temple complex that Herod the Great had renovated. The disciples are marveling at the enormous stones. And Jesus looks at them and predicts, "Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left upon another. Everyone will be thrown down."
The Olivet Discourse is an absolutely critical text for biblical scholars trying to piece together the eschatology of the early church.
Wait, eschatology. We touched on that earlier when we talked about the end of the age, but let's define it clearly. That's just the academic theological term for the study of the end times, or the ultimate destiny of humanity, right?
Exactly. It comes from the Greek word esatos, meaning last. So the Olivet Discourse is the primary eschatological teaching of Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels.
Okay.
After he predicts the destruction of the buildings, the disciples ask him when this will happen. Jesus goes on to describe a period of intense tribulation. Wars, rumors of wars, famines, intense persecution of his followers, and the rise of false messiahs.
Which all sounds terrifying.
It does. And in the Gospel of Luke's account, the warning is incredibly specific to military action. It says that when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you should know its desolation is near, and those who are in Judea should flee immediately to the mountains.
Which, given what we just discussed about the Roman siege, sounds exactly like a warning about Titus and Vespasian.
It certainly aligns with the historical events.
But then there is this highly debated, incredibly controversial phrase that Jesus uses right at the end of this speech. He says, "Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place."
If you are a modern futurist who believes these chapters are predicting a 21st century nuclear war, that phrase is very difficult to explain away.
Because it clearly says this generation.
Right. Historical critical scholars point out that in the ancient context, this generation implies a literal time frame of roughly 40 years.
Right, like the Israelites wandering in the wilderness for 40 years until that generation died off.
If Jesus made this statement during his ministry around 30 CE, and he says this generation will not pass away, the destruction of the temple by the Romans in 70 CE falls absolutely perfectly within the lifespan of that exact 40-year generational window.
Wow, the math actually works out perfectly.
Therefore, many historians interpret the Olivet Discourse not as a distant, magical roadmap for thousands of years in the future, but as an urgent, highly specific, and deeply historical warning about the impending first-century Roman siege of Jerusalem.
And Jesus also uses a specific phrase borrowed from the apocalyptic genre. He warns them to look out for the abomination of desolation. What does that mean in a historical context?
That phrase was essentially a trigger word. It comes from the book of Daniel. Historically, it referred to a traumatic event in the 2nd century BCE when a Greek king named Antiochus Epiphanes captured Jerusalem.
Okay.
He completely desecrated the temple by erecting a statue of Zeus and reportedly sacrificed a pig on the sacred altar.
That would definitely do it.
It was the ultimate abomination that caused desolation. By reusing that specific apocalyptic code word in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus is signaling to his Jewish audience that a similar catastrophic desecration of the holy space is coming again.
And historically speaking, the Roman legions bringing their pagan imperial standards into the burning temple courtyard in 70 CE fits that apocalyptic profile perfectly.
It fits it to a T.
Now, I want to ask you about a historical puzzle that I found in the notes. When you read the New Testament, absolutely no text explicitly describes the 70 CE destruction of the temple as a past, completed historical event. They don't say, hey, remember 10 years ago when the Romans burned the building? They always talk about it like it's a looming threat, or they use heavy prophetic imagery. So is the academic consensus that these texts were written right before the fire in 70 CE or shortly after it happened?
You have brilliant scholars on both sides.
Okay, so what's the argument for it being written before?
Some historians argue that the silence is deafening. Because there is no clear retrospective statement saying the temple has been destroyed, certain texts, perhaps the Gospel of Mark or even parts of Revelation, must have been written in the late 60s CE, right as the war was breaking out, but before the final collapse.
That makes sense. But what about the other side? Because if I'm writing a book to help people cope with a trauma, I might write it after the fact.
The other major camp of scholars argues that many of these texts, particularly the Gospels of Matthew and Luke and the final form of Revelation, were written after the war, perhaps in the 80s or 90s CE. They argue that the authors used a well-known ancient literary technique
known as vaticinium ex eventu, which is Latin for prophecy after the fact.
Framing the recent events prophetically.
So they write it after it happens, but frame it as a prediction.
Yes. They put the predictions into the mouth of a past figure, in this case Jesus, to explain the theological meaning of the trauma that the community had just survived.
It was a way of saying, this tragedy didn't catch God by surprise. It was part of the divine plan.
Exactly. But regardless of whether a specific scholar dates a text to 68 CE or 95 CE, the overarching scholarly consensus remains completely clear.
Which is?
The crisis language of the New Testament is deeply anchored in the extreme trauma, tension, and aftermath of the Roman-Jewish War.
So we have this massive backdrop of immense imperial violence and a shattered religious worldview.
We do.
With all of that in mind, we can finally open the actual book of Revelation. But before we get to the dragons and the beasts, we need to clarify who is actually writing this book, and more importantly, who they are writing it to.
Right, the author and the audience.
Because this wasn't a broadcast beam to the whole world. It was a very specific piece of mail.
That's right. It is technically an apocalypse, but it is framed as an epistle, a letter. The author identifies himself in the opening verses simply as John.
Just John.
Now, later church tradition, starting with early theologians like Irenaeus around 180 CE, claimed this was John the Apostle, the original disciple of Jesus, who also supposedly wrote the Gospel of John. However, modern biblical scholarship largely disagrees with that traditional view.
Why? I mean, it says John. Why wouldn't it be the same guy?
It comes down to linguistic and textual analysis. When scholars compare the original Greek of the Gospel of John to the Greek of the Book of Revelation, they are entirely different. Noticeably, the Gospel of John is written in highly polished, philosophical, and grammatically smooth Greek. The Book of Revelation, on the other hand, is written in a very rough, idiosyncratic Greek that is heavily influenced by Hebrew and Aramaic syntax.
Oh, I see.
The vocabulary, the theological themes, and the literary styles are so distinct that the overwhelming academic consensus is that they were written by two different authors. To distinguish him, scholars refer to the author of Revelation simply as John of Patmos.
Right, because he explicitly tells us in chapter 1 that he is writing from exile on the island of Patmos, which is a small, rocky island in the Aegean Sea.
Yeah.
And he addresses this massive, visionary letter to 7 real, physical, local church communities located in the Roman province of Asia Minor, which would be on the western coast of modern-day Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
He names them geographically, almost like a postal route. Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea.
This brings us to a foundational rule of the historical hermeneutics we discussed earlier, audience relevance.
Audience relevance.
The book was written to those 7 specific communities for their immediate context.
Very specific locations.
Right. In fact, he specifically calls Pergamum the place where Satan's throne is. That sounds incredibly dramatic. What was actually in Pergamum?
It is dramatic, but it's a perfect example of how historians read this text. Pergamum wasn't the literal capital of hell. It was a major center for the Roman imperial cult.
Emperor worship.
Exactly. In Asia Minor, honoring the Roman emperor wasn't just a private religious choice, it was your civic duty. Cities aggressively competed with each other for the title of neokoroi, which means the official temple guardians of the imperial cult.
So it was a point of civic pride.
A huge one. To be considered a good, loyal citizen, you participated in civic festivals, communal meals, and sacrifices that honored the emperor as a divine or semi-divine figure. It was the social and economic glue of their society.
Okay, so if you were a first-century Christian or Jew who believed you could only worship one god, you had a serious everyday problem. You couldn't participate in these patriotic imperial rituals.
Exactly. You would stand out immediately as unpatriotic or even dangerous.
And that brings us to a massive aha moment in our sources regarding one of the most famous symbols in human history, the mark of the beast. In Revelation, it says you cannot buy or sell unless you have the mark. Today, people hear that and panic about microchips, digital currency, or barcodes. But how did that actually function in the first century?
We have to look at the historical reality of the Roman economy. Many professions were organized into trade guilds. If you wanted to work as a weaver, a baker, or a merchant, you had to be in a guild.
You needed that membership to survive.
And guild meetings always involved communal meals that included sacrifices to the local gods and the emperor. If your conscience wouldn't allow you to participate, you were socially marginalized. You lost business contracts. You literally couldn't buy or sell in the local economy. So in Revelation chapter 13 describes a beast that forces everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive its mark on their right hand or their forehead in order to buy or sell.
Historians argue this is a brilliant, powerful, symbolic representation of the ancient economic and civic allegiance required by Rome.
It's not predicting a future digital tracking device implanted under the skin.
No, according to the scholarly consensus, it is describing the very real, suffocating, daily economic pressure these early Christians felt. Refusing the mark meant refusing to bow to the Roman economic and religious system, even if it meant starving.
Okay, so if the mark is a symbol of allegiance to the Roman Empire, we need to talk about the beast itself.
The beast from the sea.
Because Revelation chapter 13 introduces this monster rising out of the sea. It has 7 heads, 10 horns, the body of a leopard, the feet of a bear, and the mouth of a lion. It is an absolute terrifying mutant.
It is a grotesque image, but while it sounds like pure fantasy to us, to a first-century Jewish or Christian reader, it was actually deeply familiar.
Really? Where would they have seen this before?
This imagery is pulled almost directly out of the Hebrew Bible, specifically the book of Daniel, chapter 7. In Daniel's vision, he sees 4 distinct beasts rising from the sea: a lion, a bear, a leopard, and a terrifying 10-horned beast.
Okay, the exact same animals.
Yes. And in the context of Daniel, these beasts explicitly represented successive, violent empires that had oppressed the Jewish people: the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, and the Greeks.
Oh, I see.
In apocalyptic literature, writers consistently use monstrous mutant beasts to represent oppressive, violent, and predatory political empires.
So John of Patmos isn't inventing a new monster. He's basically taking all the scary parts of Daniel's 4 historical monsters, mashing them together into one ultimate super beast, and applying it to the current superpower, Rome.
Exactly. By combining the features of the lion, the bear, and the leopard, John is saying that the beast in Revelation represents the totality of Roman imperial power.
It's the ultimate empire.
It possesses all the violence, all the predatory nature, and all the blasphemous claims to divine authority of all the previous empires combined.
And the book gives us even more clues to crack this code, because later in the text, in chapter 17, we meet another figure, a corrupt, incredibly wealthy entity called Babylon the Great.
Yes, the great prostitute.
She is described as a prostitute who controls global commerce, who gets drunk on the blood of the saints, and who sits on a beast with 7 heads. And the text specifically says the 7 heads represent 7 mountains on which the woman is seated.
This is one of the strongest, most undeniable internal historical anchors in the entire text.
Because of the 7 mountains.
Yes. In the ancient world, Rome was universally famous as the city built on 7 hills. Ancient writers, poets like Virgil and Horace, and Roman coin makers constantly referred to Rome this way. It was the defining geographic feature of the capital.
But if he means Rome, why call it Babylon? Why not just write, hey guys, Rome is terrible?
For 2 very important reasons. First, as we mentioned earlier, direct political critique of the Roman Empire was high treason. If a Roman official intercepted a letter saying Rome is an evil beast that God is going to destroy, the author and the recipients would be executed.
Right, so it's a security measure.
But second, and more importantly, Babylon was a well-known, highly charged Jewish code name for an empire that destroys the temple.
Right, because the historical Babylonian Empire, under King Nebuchadnezzar, destroyed the first temple in 586 BCE.
Precisely. So when the Roman Empire destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE, the ancient label Babylon was immediately resurrected by Jewish and Christian writers.
They dusted off the old nickname.
To call Rome Babylon was to make a profound theological statement. It was saying, you are the new oppressor. You are the new destroyer of God's house. And just as God ultimately judged and destroyed the ancient Babylonians, he will judge and destroy you.
It is essentially ancient resistance literature encrypted in a format that the oppressors wouldn't understand, but the oppressed would instantly recognize.
That's a perfect summary.
So I want to pivot here. If the real villain of Revelation was the Roman Empire and the emperors, then who on earth is the Antichrist?
Well, this is a genuinely shocking fact for most people. The word Antichrist never actually appears anywhere in the book of Revelation.
Wait, not once.
Not once. It is completely absent. The term only appears in the entire New Testament in the very short, obscure letters of 1st and 2nd John. And in those specific letters, the author explicitly states that there are actually many antichrists, and they are already present in the community. For example, there's a verse that says, Even now, many antichrists have come.
Many.
The term originally referred to local, ordinary, false teachers who had created a theological schism and left the early Christian community.
If the Antichrist isn't the villain of Revelation, where did that idea even come from?
Over the centuries, interpreters just took a concept from the letters of John, combined it with different prophetic visions from the book of Daniel, and then just pasted it all over Revelation.
They stitched together a villain.
Exactly. But none of the original authors were actually writing about that specific singular character.
Which brings us to the ultimate cipher from Revelation chapter 13, verse 18. It says, "This calls for wisdom. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it's the number of a person. Its number is 666.
The key word in that verse that scholars point to is calculate. The author is explicitly telling his readers that this number is not arbitrary. It is a puzzle, and it is a puzzle they already possess the tools to solve. He is inviting his first century audience to use a very common ancient practice known as gematria.
Okay, let's stop and unpack this. What exactly is gematria? Because to modern ears, assigning numbers to letters sounds a bit like a conspiracy theory itself. Was this actually a common thing?
It was incredibly common. In ancient languages like Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, they didn't have a separate set of Arabic numerals like we use today, 1, 2, 3, and so on. Their alphabet letters doubled as their numbers. So the first letter, A or alpha, had a numerical value of 1, B or beta was 2, and so on, moving up into tens and hundreds.
So every letter had a built-in math value.
Right. Because of this linguistic reality, any word or any person's name could be added up to produce a specific numerical total. This was used for wordplay, riddles, and secret codes all over the ancient Greco-Roman world.
Do we have physical proof of people doing this in everyday life?
We do. One of the best examples was found by archaeologists in the ruins of Pompeii. They found a piece of graffiti scratched into a wall that read, "I love the woman whose number is 545.
That is amazing. Ancient secret admirer codes.
Exactly. The writer was using gematria to declare his love without publicly revealing the woman's actual name.
So when the author of Revelation explicitly says calculate the number of a person, he is pointing directly to gematria. He's saying, add up the letters of this guy's name. So who does 666 equal?
The number points directly to the infamous Roman emperor, Nero.
Nero.
Here is how the calculation works. If you take the emperor's official Greek title, Nero Caesar, and you transliterate it into Hebrew letters, which becomes Neron Caesar, and you add up the numerical values of those specific Hebrew letters, the sum is exactly 666.
Nun, which is 50, plus resh, 200, plus wa, 6, plus nun, 50, plus kof, 100, plus samek, 60, plus resh, 200, equals 666. It fits perfectly.
It really does.
But wait, it gets even better. There is actual archaeological proof that confirms this specific cipher.
Yes, there is.
In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists operating in Egypt discovered troves of ancient papyrus fragments of the New Testament. One of the most famous and important of these is called Papyrus 115, which dates all the way back to the 3rd century. And in this incredibly ancient, highly reliable manuscript, the number of the beast in Revelation 13 is not 666. It is listed as 616.
Yes. When this was first discovered, it caused a massive stir. For a long time, people wondered if this was just a careless scribal error, but textual scholars soon realized that 616 actually provides the ultimate, irrefutable proof for the Nero cipher.
How does a different number prove the same guy?
Because of regional spelling differences.
Oh, right.
If you spell Nero Caesar using the alternate Latin spelling, dropping the final N, so it's just Nero Caesar instead of the Greek-influenced Neron Caesar, and you run that exact Latin spelling through the same Hebrew gematria, the numerical total drops by exactly 50.
Which is the value of the letter nun that was dropped.
Exactly. It adds up perfectly to 616.
That literally gives me chills. The manuscript variant perfectly matches the regional spelling differences of the emperor's name. It's like a built-in historical verification system that proves the early Christians knew exactly who the beast was.
It is a remarkable piece of textual evidence. It absolutely grounds the text in the politics and the terror of the 1st century Roman world.
And Nero was notoriously brutal, right?
He was. He was the first emperor to actively persecute Christians in Rome, using them as human torches to light his gardens after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. He was the ultimate boogeyman for the early church.
Just absolute evil.
And there's one more layer to this beast imagery that ties back to Nero. Revelation 13 says that one of the heads of the beast had received a mortal wound, but its fatal wound had miraculously healed, and the whole world was amazed.
How does that connect to Nero?
This correlates perfectly with a massive, widely documented conspiracy theory that was sweeping the Roman Empire at the end of the 1st century, known as the Nero Redivivus legend.
Right, because Nero didn't die in battle. He was declared a public enemy by the Senate, and he committed suicide in 68 CE by stabbing himself in the throat with the help of a secretary.
Yes.
But because the Roman Empire was so vast and communication without the internet was so slow and unreliable, rumors immediately started spreading that he hadn't really died.
Exactly. People believed he had faked his own death, fled to the east to the Parthian Empire, which was Rome's greatest military rival, and was secretly amassing a massive army to come back, cross the Euphrates River, and take his violent revenge on the city of Rome.
It's like a first-century political thriller.
It was. Several imposters actually appeared in the East claiming to be Nero, and they gathered significant followings.
So the author of Revelation is taking this widespread cultural terror, this literal urban legend about a dead tyrant coming back to life, and using it symbolically.
Yes. The beast with the healed mortal wound represents the terrifying resilience of Roman imperial violence. When Nero died and the empire plunged into a chaotic civil war known as the Year of the Four Emperors, many people thought the Roman Empire was finally collapsing.
They thought the mortal wound had been struck.
But then Vespasian took power, stabilized the empire, and the crushing oppression continued. John is saying, even when one tyrant dies, the beast of empire just keeps healing and coming back.
Okay, so if the beast represents this overwhelming economic and military power of Rome, who represents the resistance standing up to it?
That brings us to chapter 11.
The two witnesses. The figures who breathe fire, stop the rain, and are eventually killed by the beast in the city streets.
Well, look at the actions attributed to them. Breathing fire and stopping rain mirror the exact miracles of Elijah. Striking the earth with plagues mirrors Moses.
Well, the law and the prophets.
Exactly. In ancient Jewish tradition, Moses and Elijah represented the law and the prophets.
So they embody the entirety of the faithful tradition standing up against corrupt earthly kings. But wait, if they aren't literal individuals, who are they actually supposed to be?
The text gives us the key. It describes these two witnesses as lampstands. And if you read the very first chapter of Revelation, the author explicitly defines what a lampstand is. It symbolizes a church, a community of believers.
Oh. Okay, so we aren't talking about two literal guys breathing fire in a modern street. This is more like a political cartoon where two heroic figures represent a whole movement's resistance.
That is exactly how historians say to read it. By portraying the witnesses as Moses and Elijah, the author is telling these terrified, marginalized communities meeting in secret, you are standing in the exact same prophetic tradition as the greatest heroes of our past.
Wow. That's actually incredibly empowering.
It really is. The pattern described persecution, followed by divine vindication, was a standard literary way in Jewish apocalyptic literature to process trauma.
It's saying that even if the empire crushes your physical body, your faithful witness is victorious in the eyes of divine justice. Now, they preach for exactly 42 months, and that specific timeline shows up constantly in modern doomsday predictions. Is that a literal 3.5-year countdown?
Not at all. 42 months, which is exactly 3.5 years, is classic, standard apocalyptic time symbolism. The author borrows this math directly from the much older book of Daniel, which repeatedly talks about a period of a time, times, and half a time. Here is the underlying logic. 3.5 is exactly half of the number 7. If the number 7 represents divine completeness and total order, then 3.5 represents a broken, fractured, interrupted time. It symbolizes a limited, intense period of chaos and crisis. It's a beautifully poetic way of saying to the reader, yes, the suffering is intense and terrible, but its time is strictly limited. It is a broken timeline, and God will eventually cut it short.
So if time is symbolic, what about the other highly specific numbers? Like the number 7 shows up everywhere. 7 seals, 7 bowls.
Right.
And then there's the famous 144,000. People knock on doors today telling you that's the exact literal head count of who gets to go to heaven. So let's briefly explain the numbers 7 and 144,000.
Let's do it. So the number 7 is basically the rhythmic heartbeat of this book. 7 churches, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls.
It's everywhere.
It is. And in ancient Jewish literature, 7 represents completeness or fullness. It's deeply rooted in the ancient 7-day creation narrative.
So when the text uses the number 7, it isn't trying to give you a sequential checklist of events.
It's communicating the idea of a complete cycle.
Okay, that makes sense. But then we hit chapter 7, and we get the number 144,000. And people have built entire modern high-control religious systems around this specific number.
Yeah, treating it as a literal, hyper-exclusive seating capacity for heaven.
Which is terrifying if you think you might be number 144,001.
Exactly. And it's tragic because it completely misses the inclusive, expansive poetry of how ancient numerology worked. Biblical scholars often interpret 144,000 as a symbolic multiplier.
Okay, walk me through the math here.
Sure. You take 12, which represents the 12 tribes of ancient Israel.
Right.
You multiply it by 12, representing the 12 apostles of the early Christian movement. movement.
Okay, so 12 times 12 is 144.
Yes. And then you multiply that by 1,000. In the ancient world, multiplying something by 1,000 wasn't a strict census count. It was a symbol of massive, uncountable magnitude.
Oh, it's like when you say to a friend, I've told you 1,000,000 times.
Yes. Perfect analogy.
You haven't literally kept a tally mark up to 1,000,000. You are just using a massive number to convey a sense of overwhelming magnitude.
Exactly. The author is mathematically uniting the ancient heritage of Israel with the new movement of the apostles and multiplying it to the maximum degree.
So it's not a velvet rope keeping people out.
No. Scholarly consensus suggests this number represents the ultimate fullness and complete inclusion of God's people. They were using numbers to communicate profound truths about divine protection.
So reading these numbers as a strict population count just totally strips the ancient author's beautiful poetry of its actual meaning.
It absolutely does.
That brings us to a word that has become completely synonymous with the end of the world.
Armageddon.
Armageddon appears in Revelation chapter 16, verse 16, but the word itself is actually a Greek transliteration of a Hebrew phrase, har Megiddo, and that translates simply to Mount Megiddo. So Mount Megiddo isn't some mythic supernatural realm in the clouds. It is a real place you can point to on a map.
It is a real physical location in ancient Israel because it sat on a major geographic choke point, a trade route connecting the massive empires of Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. The plains of Megiddo were the site of many famous, bloody historical battles in ancient times.
So it was the ultimate crossroads of conflict.
Scholarly consensus suggests that Har Megiddo is a symbolic reference to the decisive downfall of oppressive imperial power. It is not a literal GPS coordinate for a future modern global war with tanks and helicopters.
So using Har Megiddo to a first-century audience is basically like someone today saying a politician met their Waterloo. You aren't literally saying they traveled to a town in Belgium. You are using a historical shorthand for an empire-ending defeat.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it reveals how sophisticated this literature truly is.
The very first verse of chapter 1, it says, this is a revelation of things what must soon take place.
Soon being the operative word there.
Yes. And just 2 verses later, in verse 3, it doubles down, saying, the time is near.
Scholarly consensus views words like soon and near as indicating real temporal nearness.
Within the author's own historical horizon.
Exactly. You have to remember the psychological reality of the audience. This text was written to communities facing immediate, crushing social and political pressure.
Right. They were suffering right then.
So if you tell someone who might be arrested tomorrow that relief is coming soon, but you actually mean millennia from now.
Yeah, that's not comforting.
No, it's not comforting at all. It's cruel.
The urgency is the entire point. And what's wild is that the author structurally bookends the whole document with this ticking clock. If you flip all the way to the end, to chapter 22, it hits you with this rapid-fire repetition. Verse 7 says, I am coming soon. Verse 12 says, I am coming soon. And finally, verse 20, the ultimate concluding promise of the text is, yes, I am coming soon.
And that repetition is standard apocalyptic urgency language.
So is deliberate.
Very much so. Academics point out that this framework of immediate arrival was designed to encourage faithfulness right then and there. It anchored the text's temporal horizon.
So they weren't thinking about the distant future.
No. When that first-century audience rolled up the scroll after hearing it read aloud, they didn't think they had just listened to a calendar for the 21st century.
Right.
They believed divine justice and vindication were literally just over the horizon.
But that brings up a massive question. If they believed this intervention was happening soon, what exactly did they think that intervention would look like?
Right, because the imagery gets wild very quickly.
It does. Back in chapter 1, verse 7, the text describes someone coming with the clouds. Now, if I read that literally, I'm picturing a physical figure floating down from the sky on a cumulus cloud.
Which is exactly how a lot of modern readers visualize it.
Obviously, yeah.
What's fascinating here is that academic scholars trace this exact cloud imagery straight back to the Hebrew Bible. In ancient Near Eastern literature, clouds represent divine authority, vindication, and the presence of God.
So it's not a literal weather report.
No, not at all. It's a massive political and theological statement. It's not a description of physical travel.
To the original audience who knew their Hebrew scriptures, coming on the clouds meant a demonstration of absolute divine power over earthly empires like Rome.
It's the author saying, Jesus is the true ruler, not Caesar.
And that makes so much sense when you look at how the text talks to the specific local churches.
It gets very personal there.
Right. In chapter 2, verse 5, it warns the church, I'm coming to you. And in verse 16, I'm coming soon. And again in chapter 3, verse 11, I am coming soon.
Notice how targeted that is. The author is writing to localized communities in Asia Minor who were dealing with internal corruption or maybe complacency or theological drift. But then the text throws in a different metaphor.
Right. Chapter 16, verse 15 says, I am coming like a thief. That is a sudden shift in tone.
It is a massive shift, and it's a very common early Christian metaphor. Historians view the thief in the night imagery as a symbol for suddenness and unpredictability.
So you can't map it out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The focus shifts entirely from a specific timeline to a state of constant vigilance.
It's the anxiety of the surprise inspection.
Literally. It meant they couldn't just assimilate into Roman society and get comfortable.
Because they'd get caught off guard.
Right. They had to remain faithful in their daily lives because the divine audit, so to speak, could happen at any unexpected moment.
And that psychological tension, between the immediate comfort of just compromising with the empire.
Which would have been so tempting.
Totally. The tension between that and the difficult demand of remaining faithful to their specific religious identity is what drives all that intense imagery of judgment that follows.
Oh, absolutely. That tension is the engine for the rest of the book.
In chapter 6, verses 12 through 17, we get a full-blown cosmic collapse. The sun turns black like sackcloth, the moon turns blood red, and the stars literally fall from the sky to the earth.
It sounds like an extinction-level event.
Right. If I'm reading this as a modern person, my brain immediately goes to meteor showers, rogue asteroids, and action movie destruction.
Naturally.
But you're saying historians read this totally differently.
Academic scholars recognize this cosmic collapse as traditional prophetic imagery.
From where?
It's drawn directly from the Hebrew prophets, like Isaiah and Joel. When ancient prophets wanted to describe the fall of a corrupt nation or the toppling of a regime, they used the deconstruction of the cosmos as a poetic metaphor.
Oh, I see. So when a modern person says the world turned upside down after a major political election.
Right. We know they don't mean a literal shift in gravity.
Exactly. So the ancient audience understood stars falling in the exact same way. It was a poetic, politically charged way to describe the absolute certainty of regime change and divine justice.
And you see that same repurposing of everyday realities later on.
Like in chapter 14?
Yes, verses 14 through 16. The text describes a figure seated on a cloud swinging a sickle to harvest the earth.
Which sounds kind of grim to us.
It does to modern readers, but to an agrarian society, the harvest isn't a spooky, esoteric symbol. It's the inevitable, natural conclusion of a growing season. It meant that the oppressive actions of the Roman Empire and the faithful actions of the believers would eventually be reaped and sorted out by a just God.
What does this all mean for how we read the most famous battle scene in the book?
Chapter 19.
Right, verses 11 through 16. We have a rider on a white horse, eyes like blazing fire, coming to strike down the nations. But the weapon is incredibly specific. It's a sharp sword coming out of his mouth. Now, if we read this like a literal military battle, do we actually rob the text of its intended power?
We completely neutralize its power if we read it literally. Scholarly consensus is that this is a brilliant symbolic depiction of divine victory.
Because of the mouth detail.
Exactly. The crucial detail is exactly what you pointed out. The sword is in the mouth, not the hand. This represents judgment by the word, by truth.
Wow.
It is not a literal, physical, military slaughter.
That is such a vital distinction. For an audience living in terror of the literal iron swords of the Roman legions, the author is providing this massive subversive hope.
Right, a different kind of power.
Yes, true power, ultimate victory, won't be achieved by out-violencing Rome. It will be achieved through divine truth.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, apocalyptic literature uses these extreme symbols to convey absolute final justice, and that ultimate justice culminates in chapter 20.
Verses 11 through 15, right, with the vision of the great white throne.
The dead are judged according to what they had done. Historians describe this as the apocalyptic courtroom.
The final reckoning.
Yes, it symbolizes the absolute defeat of death and evil themselves. For communities experiencing deep marginalization and martyrdom, this courtroom scene was the ultimate assurance. It told them, your suffering is seen, it is recorded, and ultimate justice will eventually balance the scales of human history.
Which clears the stage for my absolute favorite part of the book.
The ending.
And that brings us to chapter 21, the ultimate restoration.
It's a beautiful chapter.
It really is. Verse 1 describes a new heaven and a new earth, and then drops this incredibly specific detail. And there was no longer any sea.
That always trips people up.
Yeah, why single out the ocean?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture of the ancient Near Eastern worldview, the sea was the ultimate symbol of primordial chaos, danger, and death.
So, sea monsters and terrible storms.
Exactly. Shipwrecks, the unknown. Furthermore, for a first-century audience in Asia Minor, the Mediterranean Sea was the literal highway the Roman Empire used to transport its military legions and extract economic wealth.
So saying there is no more sea isn't like a geographic hatred of the beach.
No, not at all.
It's a profound political and spiritual comfort. It means the chaos is gone. The imperial threat is gone. You are finally safe.
And then, in verse 2, the holy city, the New Jerusalem, comes down out of heaven from God. That downward movement feels incredibly important.
Yes, it comes down to earth.
It is the hinge of the entire theology of the text.
So it's not about leaving.
Oh, right. The goal is not an evacuation plan where humanity escapes a ruined, burning planet to go play harps in the clouds.
Which is how it's often portrayed.
I know, but the goal is the total restoration and healing of the physical world. The divine presence completely enters human space.
And verse 3 makes that explicit. It says, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them.
It's about presence.
And then verse 4 delivers what might be the most famous comforting image in all of ancient literature. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain.
It's so powerful. This imagery is lifted directly from Isaiah chapter 25, verse 8.
Oh, another Hebrew Bible connection.
Yes, it's covenant fulfillment language. But on a human level, just imagine the visceral impact of hearing those words read aloud in a secret house church.
A church where members have recently been executed or imprisoned by the state.
Exactly. It is a direct, intimate consolation. It promised them that their current grief was not permanent, and more importantly, that the divine intimately recognized their pain.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me, because the text suddenly shifts from this deeply emotional poetry into bizarre architectural blueprints.
The measurements.
Yeah, verse 16 describes the dimensions of this new city coming down, and it says it is shaped as a perfect cube. The length, width, and height are all equal. What on earth is the historical context for a giant cubic city?
I mean, it sounds like science fiction until you look at the architecture of the Hebrew Bible. In the ancient temple in Jerusalem, the inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies.
The epicenter of God's presence.
Exactly. It was built as a perfect cube. So by describing the entire new city as a cube, the author is taking that temple symbolism and expanding it infinitely.
Because for centuries, the sacred presence of God was confined to this tiny, dark, cubic room in a temple where only one person could go once a year.
Right, the high priest.
But here, the walls have blown off,
Yeah.
the holiness is spilled out and expanded to fill the entire restored world. Every inch of the city is now the Holy of Holies.
Which perfectly explains verse 22, where the author explicitly notes, I did not see a temple in the city.
Because the whole city is the temple.
Biblical scholars point out that this concept was completely revolutionary. In the first century Roman world, every major city had a temple.
They were everywhere.
Temples were the center of civic life, economics, and imperial propaganda. To envision a massive city with no temple meant that the hierarchical structures of religion, priesthoods, and empire had been rendered entirely obsolete. The separation between humanity and the divine is gone. You have direct access.
Verses 23 through 25 say, the city doesn't need the sun or the moon because divine glory gives it light. And this is the key, its gates will never be shut.
In the ancient world, a city's gates were its only defense. You closed the massive city gates at sundown or whenever an enemy army was approaching, just to survive.
So open gates meant you were deeply vulnerable.
Exactly. But in this vision, the gates are permanently locked open.
For an audience living under the oppressive thumb of Rome, constantly anxious about the next wave of persecution.
Hearing that the gates of their eternal home would never be shut meant they could finally, truly lay down their defenses.
That's incredible.
It was a promise that all threats had been permanently neutralized. It is a vision of ultimate, exhaustive rest.
So we have a book that is deeply, intricately anchored in its own time. It's a brilliant piece of literature criticizing the Roman Empire, using Jewish apocalyptic math, local economic realities, and political urban legends.
Yes.
But considering how wild, subversive, and confusing this book is, I have to ask, how did it even make it into the Bible? I mean, an ancient text filled with multi-headed dragons, cryptic numerology, and anti-government rhetoric seems like a really risky thing for early church leaders to declare as holy universal scripture.
It was incredibly risky. And frankly, it almost didn't make the cut.
Really?
The process of deciding which early Christian writings belonged in the official New Testament is called canon formation, and it was a messy process that took centuries. The Book of Revelation was easily one of the most controversial and highly contested books in early Christianity.
I can totally see why.
While some early Christian writers in the West, like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus, supported its inclusion, the Eastern Christian churches deeply, deeply distrusted it. In fact, for centuries, many Eastern churches absolutely refused to read it out loud in public worship.
Okay.
And if you look at some of the earliest lists of canonical books drawn up by Eastern bishops, Revelation is completely excluded.
Why were they so afraid of it? What was the danger?
This raises an important question about how ancient texts can be reinterpreted and weaponized by later generations.
Okay, what?
The context had shifted. In the middle of the 2nd century, a radical movement emerged in Asia Minor called Montanism. The leader, a man named Montanus, along with 2 female prophets, claimed to receive new, direct, ecstatic revelations from the Holy Spirit. And they heavily relied on the intense, violent imagery of the Book of Revelation to claim that the end of the world was imminent. They specifically preached that the New Jerusalem mentioned in Revelation 21 was going to literally, physically descend out of the clouds and land in their specific small town of Papusa in Phrygia.
So they were basically an early 2nd century doomsday cult using Revelation as their operating manual.
Precisely. They were whipping people into apocalyptic frenzies, and this terrified the mainstream institutional church leaders.
I bet it did.
They saw firsthand how easily the book's cosmic, violent imagery could be hijacked, stripped of its original Roman context, and used to fuel apocalyptic extremism, social disruption, and radical cults. Because of the Montanus crisis, many prominent church fathers argued that Revelation was simply too dangerous and too easily misunderstood to include in the official Bible.
But here's where I'm genuinely getting stuck.
Okay, what is it?
If this code was so universally understood by the ancient audience, Why did the early church fathers lose the thread so quickly?
That's a great question.
Like, why did it take us centuries to rediscover this was about Rome if it was supposedly obvious to them?
Because the political reality shifted dramatically. Within a few centuries, Christianity went from being an illegal, persecuted sect to the official state religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine.
Oh, right.
You can't keep teaching a book as a fiery, subversive takedown of Rome when the Roman emperor is now your primary patron and defender.
The interpretation had to evolve for the text to remain relevant.
Exactly. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the influential theologian Augustine of Hippo popularized a highly symbolic spiritual interpretation, the theological view known as amillennialism.
Okay, another big term. Break down amillennialism for us.
In Revelation chapter 20, there is a mention of a 1,000-year reign of Christ a millennium. Early literalists, like the Montanists, thought this meant Jesus was coming back soon to set up a physical, political, earthly kingdom that would last for exactly 1,000 years.
Right.
Augustine looked at this and said, no, the 1,000 years is symbolic, just like the other numbers in the book. He argued that the millennium represents the era of the church itself. The kingdom isn't a future political state, it is a spiritual reality happening right now through the influence of Christianity in the world.
So he took the timeline and essentially neutralized it.
By spiritualizing the 1,000-year timeline, Augustine effectively diffused the ticking time bomb of the book. He removed the urgency for doomsday predictions. Because of Augustine's massive intellectual weight, his symbolic amillennial reading became the dominant orthodox view for over 1,000 years throughout the entire Middle Ages.
That makes sense.
The book was accepted into the canon because it was no longer seen as a literal roadmap for the end of the world.
But, theological ideas don't stay static. Fast forward to the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation, you have figures like Martin Luther and John Calvin, and they are locked in a massive existential, political, and theological war with the Catholic Church and the papacy.
Yes.
And what do? They pull the Book of Revelation off the shelf, but they don't use Augustine's spiritual view. They use a new method called historicism.
Historicism is a fascinating shift. This view interprets Revelation as a long, continuous, chronological panorama of church history, starting from the 1st century and stretching all the way to the end of time.
Okay.
And the Protestant reformers found this framework incredibly useful for their specific conflict. They looked at the corruptions of the medieval church and simply took the apocalyptic labels from Revelation, the Beast, Babylon the Great, and the Antichrist, and applied them directly to the papacy and the institution of the Catholic Church.
They just remapped the ancient symbols of the Roman Empire onto their present-day political and religious enemy.
Exactly. It was a highly effective polemical tool. For centuries, Protestant theologians used Revelation to argue that the Pope was the literal Antichrist predicted by John of Patmos.
It's like the ultimate rhetorical weapon. If you want to delegitimize your opponent, just prove from the Bible that they are the beast.
It was very potent.
But even during the Reformation, they weren't doing what we see today. Martin Luther wasn't making elaborate flowcharts about nuclear wars in the Middle East or microchips and vaccines. So where did our modern pop culture view of Revelation come from? The very specific view that the book is a step-by-step, literal timeline of future 21st century events.
To find the origin of that specific framework, we have to jump forward to the 19th century, primarily looking at religious movements in America and Britain. This is the era when modern futurism is truly invented. And according to historians and sociologists, it starts with a profound, traumatic event known as the Great Disappointment.
It is honestly a heartbreaking story of human psychology. Tell us what happened in the 1840s.
In the 1830s and 40s, an American Baptist preacher named William Miller became obsessed with apocalyptic prophecy. He used complex, highly literal math applied to the Book of Daniel and the Book of Revelation to predict the exact date of the end of the world.
What date did he pick?
He publicly announced that Jesus Christ would return to cleanse the earth with fire sometime between March 1843 and March 1844.
And people actually believed him.
He gained a massive, fervent following. They were known as the Millerites. Tens of thousands of people across the United States believed his calculations were infallible. As the dates approached, the fervor reached a fever pitch. Some people reportedly sold their farms, gave away all their money, refused to plant crops for the next year, and literally sat on hillsides waiting for the sky to split open.
But the date came and went. The sun rose the next day. Nothing happened.
Nothing happened. It was a crushing, devastating psychological blow. It became known as the Great Disappointment. People were left bankrupt, mocked by their neighbors, and spiritually shattered.
It's a tragic story. But how does that failure lead to the modern charts we have today?
It was a defining moment in modern religious history because out of the ashes of that failed movement, new traditions had to form. Groups like the Seventh-day Adventists emerged, and they had to rapidly reinterpret what happened to explain the failure.
But more broadly, the cultural shockwave of the 19th century became a fertile breeding ground for entirely new, highly systematized ways to read biblical prophecy. And the most important figure to emerge in this era was an Anglo-Irish clergyman named John Nelson Darby.
Darby. From what I read, this guy is essentially the architect of the modern end times chart.
Darby was a leader in the Plymouth Brethren movement, and he invented a complex theological system known as dispensationalism.
Oh, let's define that one clearly.
Dispensationalism divides all of human history into distinct, rigidly defined dispensations or eras of time, claiming that God interacts with humanity completely differently in each era. But Darby's most famous, most culturally impactful innovation was his popularization of a concept called the rapture.
The rapture.
Yep.
This is the idea that true believers will suddenly, instantaneously vanish from the earth, taken up to heaven, leaving their clothes behind, right before a massive 7-year period of global suffering and warfare called the tribulation, which is then followed by the literal 1,000-year earthly reign of Christ. And it is vital for listeners to understand that this specific, highly detailed timeline, a secret pre-tribulation rapture followed by a literal Antichrist ruling a global government, was totally, completely foreign to the early Christian church. You will not find it in Augustine, you will not find it in Thomas Aquinas, and you will not find it in Martin Luther. It is a very specific 19th century interpretive framework invented by Darby.
So how on earth did Darby's niche 19th century idea become the absolute default way that millions of people and Hollywood read the Bible today?
The answer is mass media and publishing. In 1909, a theologian named Cyrus Scofield published the Scofield Reference Bible. It became a massive, unprecedented bestseller in the United States. Scofield was a dedicated follower of Darby's dispensationalist timeline.
Okay.
And he did something revolutionary. He embedded Darby's futuristic timeline directly into the footnotes of the Bible, printed on the exact same page as the scripture text.
Oh, wow. That is incredibly powerful. So if you buy a Scofield Bible, you read the ancient verse from Revelation, and then your eyes drop to the bottom of the page, and the footnote tells you exactly where that verse fits on a modern timeline of the future.
Precisely. Generations of readers grew up assuming that the highly specific timeline in the footnotes was the original orthodox meaning of the text. It blurred the line between the ancient scripture and the 19th century commentary.
That is wild.
And this theological framework absolutely exploded in the 20th century with the advent of modern mass media. You had Hal Lindsey's 1970 blockbuster book, The Late Great Planet Earth, which sold tens of millions of copies. He explicitly argued that the prophecies in Revelation were predicting the Soviet Union, the modern state of Israel, and a coming nuclear holocaust. And then, of course, you have the Left Behind novel series in the 90s and 2000s, which sold over 80 million copies.
Huge phenomena.
That fictional series essentially cemented the dispensationalist timeline. The sudden disappearances, the global dictator, the mark of the beast as technology into global pop culture. Even people who have never stepped foot in a church know the plot of Left Behind.
We've covered a massive, sprawling historical journey today. We started in the ashes of the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE, feeling the trauma of watching the Roman Empire drag the golden menorah through the streets in a victory parade.
We did.
We sat with John at Patmos on a rocky island, writing heavily coded resistance letters to 7 local churches who are being financially squeezed by the trade guilds and the emperor cult. We decoded ancient gematria to unmask Nero Caesar as the beast. And we watched as centuries of history mutated this ancient, localized resistance letter into modern high-control prophecy charts designed to keep people in a state of constant, breathless anxiety. What is the ultimate takeaway from all these sources?
The ultimate takeaway is that understanding this context does 2 vital things. First, it acts as an intellectual shield. When you understand the historical realities of the Roman-Jewish War, the imperial cult, and the ancient conventions of apocalyptic literature, it frees you from modern, fear-based manipulation.
You no longer have to be terrified that a barcode or a credit card is a literal mark of damnation.
But second, it restores the original dignity of the text itself. The scholarly consensus frames Revelation not as a terrifying crystal ball, but as a brilliant, poetic, and fiercely defiant piece of ancient resistance literature. It was written to give hope, resilience, and courage to a marginalized community surviving the crushing weight of the Roman Empire. Its message to the first century was that no matter how powerful the beast of empire seems, divine justice and truth will ultimately outlast human tyranny.
That is incredibly empowering. It takes a book that has been actively used to terrify people for generations and turns it back into a testament of human resilience and hope against empire. Now think about the world we live in right now. Think about our modern, highly secular world of algorithmic echo chambers, where social media feeds are literally designed to constantly push outrage, conspiracy theories, and narratives of imminent societal collapse just to keep us engaged and clicking. Could this digital technology be creating a brand new kind of high-control apocalyptic anxiety today? Even without a religious text, are we, right now, still inventing modern beasts and Babylons to cope with our own chaotic world? The psychology of the ancient apocalypse didn't die when the Roman Empire fell. It might actually be more alive today than ever before.